So Louis, first of all, I don't know if all of you have had the opportunity to see the film in its entirety. It's 40 minutes long, and it's a very multi-layered work. And therefore, I would like to ask you if you could maybe talk a little bit about the different topics that you explore in the film and how it came to be. I think that's an interesting starting point for our conversation.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the film, it's shown upstairs. It's called Lettres du Voyant, which is French. That's a French title. I made it in a French film school, actually. So actually, I mean, that's an interesting thing to say, is like the film came out of the second year in a master's program that I did in a school in the north of France called Le Fresnois. And that school is kind of a cinema school, but they can't, and this is me, like I'm going to maybe get in trouble, but they basically get their funding from the French government because they're not La Femis, which is the other big cinema school in Paris, right? And the way Le Fresnois separates itself from not being La Femis is that they kind of pretend that they're this research institution of what they call new technology, les nouvelles technologies. And when I went there, I was just like, yeah, but what do you guys even mean with that term? Like, what is new technology? Because there were people that were working with what I considered quite old technologies, which wasn't a problem either. But it's supposed to be this kind of center for technological innovation. So there's people doing kind of like these interactive installations. Like often going to Le Fresnois, you might go to the private view for the show or whatever, and there's these people, and they're just like going up to artworks like that. And it's just a photograph. And then they're like, oh, and they're bored. So there's this thing of technology there. Anyway, so I was in that situation, and I became very critical of their kind of obsession with what technology represented as something exciting and new. And so what I wanted to do, and in the second year in this film school, we're obliged to make a work that engages with what they call new technology. And I said, well, I'm not just going to engage with something without any critical reflection on what that engagement entails. So I specifically wanted to make a work that wouldn't just use new technology in a banal way or wouldn't just use it for the sake of using it because we get money, right? I wanted to kind of think about how to use a technology that might, in some respects, create a critical position to this obsession with technological advancement that we have in the overdeveloped world. And so, yeah, so then, you know, at that time there was research and things being done by various people into this place called Agblogboshi, which is in Ghana, in Accra, in the capital, which is a big waste ground, dumping ground, but for lots of things, fridges, cars, but also computers. And there were lots of stories of these shipping containers arriving from like North America and places like that, and literally tipping, you know, piles and piles of computers. So I suppose in some respects the project began as a way to sort of provoke the school I was working in, to sort of have a bit more of a critical reflection on their own understanding of what technology is in its relationship to forms of global capitalism. And then I also had a close connection with Ghana. I mean, this is something that comes up as like the backstory for the film. But you know, my grandfather was an archaeologist. God, I wonder how many times I've said that phrase now. But he was an archaeologist. He was a specialist in African archaeology, mostly working in North Africa first, and then after the revolution in Egypt, in '52. And then the independence of Sudan, and then he was working in Khartoum, and he lost his job, and he got an invitation eventually, like a few years later, from Kwame Nkrumah to come to Ghana to work in this sort of Pan-Africanist project of teaching archaeology to young Ghanaian students and taking them to other parts of the continent to conduct archaeological surveys and to keep their findings within the continent. It was this political project of how to use archaeology to kind of generate a sort of Pan-Africanist politics. And my grandfather was paramount in that kind of movement. And then he ended up just he fell in love with a woman there who's my grandmother, is my mother's stepmother. And they did archaeological work themselves in Ghana together. She's Ghanaian. And then he stayed there. So then I used to have stories of going to Ghana from them, and then I went there as a kid, and it was all this kind of thing of like thinking about the history of Ghana through digging into its earth. And then I started to read that in relationship with Ghana's history as a place that was mined for gold, and then started to see a series of relationships between the gold mines and then the current, what was happening in this place, Agblogboshi, where people were breaking down computer hardware to try and strip it for precious metals like copper and zinc and bits of gold, not much, but some. So, so the film was sort of generated in that space. And then just to finish this part here, but just that then what that led to was the film actually focuses on this phenomenon called Sakawa, which is a form of email scam that's aided through what the Ghanaians call juju magic. So it's a sort of, it's what gets exported through slavery to the Caribbean. In Haiti, it's called voodoo. I think people are more familiar with voodoo if we understand what voodoo is. So these kind of, like animist practice, whereby a juju doctor would give somebody some kind of special powers and spells to help them with their email scam. And what I found particularly interesting with these guys doing Sakawa, doing this email scam, was they saw the email scam as a form of like post-colonial kind of economic repatriation for the theft of resources during the times of British colonialism in Ghana. And these email scammers were like, we're not breaking the law, we're just getting back some gold that basically belongs to us. I found that quite provocative as a statement. And then seeing that blended with, this reinvigoration of kind of pre-colonial, religious practices. So the film comes out of that, basically. If that makes any, that's kind of complicated, right? But you have to watch the film, it makes more sense. The film's a bit clearer.
Can you tell us a little bit about what scam baiting is in this context as well? Because I think this is something that you are also very aware of. And
Yeah, for sure. So scam baiting is like a sort of neo-colonialist, like white male European violent practice. Basically, I say that in all truth, because if you look, there's scam baiting is these guys, it's like these bored, like bros. I don't know if you're familiar with the term bro, but whatever, look it up. There's these like bros that are kind of think they're like super action heroes, and they kind of have taken it onto themselves to like try and get back at email scammers. So there's lots of websites that were set up where people would get in touch with an email scammer, and then they would kind of string them along, pretending they're going to eventually give them money. And then they don't ever give them money, but they make them do ridiculous things. And then they make them photograph themselves. So they say to the scammer in Accra or something, okay, I'm going to give you this, $500,000, but first I need you to dress up as a chicken and to run around the streets of Accra, and you have to photograph it. And people would do this stuff. And I saw that happening at the time. There was a few kind of articles about it, kind of laughing with them, thinking it was kind of funny. And I just felt like it stunk of like the continuation of a sort of racist, colonialist attitude towards these practices. And I wanted to make a work that would like do the absolute, and there was like a Vice documentary, Vice, this like hipster bro kind of program thing on the internet. And they did a report about email scammers in Ghana. And again, the whole positioning of the point of view of that documentary was like, again, super neo-colonial and very patronizing. So I wanted to make a work that would completely sort of counteract those narratives by, sort of offering up something completely different. There was a bit more, it's sort of positioning the email scammers as if they're creating forms of like, kind of like neo-colonial or kind of anti-colonial resistance within a neo-colonial space, which is, which is the internet, basically.
We hear in the film also a person reading out letters that in the fiction of the film were sent to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the different narratives transported through these letters and where these texts and words come from and what the idea is behind it?
Yeah, so the film, it's called Lettres du Voyant, so it's based on this epistolary exchange, which is a technique that I've used before in lots of other works. In perhaps all of the work I made up until then was always using an exchange between two people through letters as a way to kind of build the narrative arc as such. And in this film, it's the same thing. There's a narrator, it's a Ghanaian who's reading to me. It's almost basically, the film begins with this phrase. It says, "Dear Louis, now you know the truth. Let's move on." I can't remember what else he says. "Perhaps you can help me," something like that. So the idea is that the film begins on the point where I have been in touch with the scammer, and I've said to the scammer, "Okay, I know you're an email scammer. I know what's happening, but let's move beyond this. Let's try and construct like a work together." And that's the conversation that starts. And then the film is entirely constituted of his emails to me. But in fact, the text is written, or not written, the text was constructed or assembled by me with fragments from a whole variety of different texts and conversations. So when I was in Ghana, conversations with email scammers, conversations with people that practice sakawa, conversations with my grandmother, conversations with family members, mostly about, and just little fragments of history, especially in relationship to sort of post-independence Ghana and the politics of Nkrumah, bits like that get woven in, especially in relationship to religion in Ghana. But then there's also a large portion of text which comes from, and I told you this last night, but it's a surprise, a book called Heinrich von Ofterdingen by Novalis. So yesterday it was such a trip to see the film subtitled in German. I was like, wow, like it's a German text. Bastardized into English, or not bastardized, that's the wrong word, but like translated, but whatever, transformed into English, and then now put back into German again. And this text by by Novalis, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, is a sort of coming-of-age tale about a guy, a classic German Enlightenment kind of narrative, German romantic narrative, of a young man who is going through a sort of spiritual development to become a poet. And in the process, he goes inside a mine and has a spiritual experience with a hermit that lives inside a mine. But then there's also, like, in the text, there's also bits of Shakespeare, bits of Hannah Arendt, bits of Kwame Nkrumah. It's a complete, like, the whole voiceover is a complete, sort of assembled, fragmented text.
And we actually also see the mine in the film as a 3D model, which is composed about of all these thousands of pixels. Can you tell us a little bit about how you developed these models and what techniques you used, and how you use like these techniques as a model, as a means of like designing this this part in the composition of your film?
Yeah, because that's so the film is constituted also of two kind of elements. Like one, the main body of the film is made from images that I filmed myself with a camera, 5D, with a nice lens and stuff. And then the other part are these images that entirely exist within a three-dimensional kind of abstract space of computer software. And what they are, they're this thing called point clouds. I don't know if you're familiar. Actually, point clouds became slightly cliched now. Lots of artists started using point clouds. It's not a bad thing. It's cool. I like cliches. But so I think people are more familiar with them now. But what it is, a point cloud is made from a laser scanner. So you have, and I'm not like a technician, but I know roughly how it works. But there's like an object called a laser scanner, and it shoots out lasers. This sounds like crackpot kind of science. Shoots out lasers that bounce off hard material, and then come back into a sensor in the laser scanner, and then that scanner can kind of build up a picture of the three-dimensional space that surrounds it. But it does it with dots because it's shooting out lasers. And those dots then get configured in a three-dimensional space on an axis of X, Y, and Z. And then from that, you can make a 3D model. So I guess I was interested in approaching that technique initially because the whole film is in many, and all my work in general engages very much with the different uses of different visualizing technologies within cinema as a way to kind of unfold and construct different points of view and different narrational techniques. So I often use different cameras in my films. I don't ever use like one camera or one imaging or one sort of imaging technology. I use scanners always, also like mobile phones, GoPros, found images, desktop recordings, all these different forms. And in this one, I was interested to see how we can use a piece of technology that would be making digital representations of something that was actually really existing. So rather than just building a 3D space in a computer software from scratch, you're actually working with, you know, really existing material as such, which is the earth, which is rock and stone. So what I liked in that was like to sort of push this emphasis and this understanding that the digital was something also very much material and solid. It was just working within a different realm as such, which was part of this whole project I did for a few years, which was like doing kind of materialist readings of the internet and thinking about the internet as like a very much material space that we could inhabit. And that's what these email scammers do. When they do a juju spell, they can transport their body through fiber optic cables. So they would literally turn their body into a sort of light source and shoot it down fiber optic cables, which would enable them to travel from Ghana to like Canada without a visa or a passport, for example. And it was just like a different understanding. And when I spoke to people, like I spoke to this guy in Ghana about that, I said, you know, so what do you think about this idea of people traveling via the internet, like fiber optic cables? And he said, well, it makes sense because we always have these myths in Ghana of witches and wizards that could like travel through space and time instantaneously. So of course, like we've just made that in contemporary terms and kind of fixed it onto this reading of the internet. But nonetheless, for me, that was this idea again, exactly, of this kind of thing of how one embodies differently forms of digital technology. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And maybe one more question from me before we open up to the floor. Last night, we were talking a lot and discussing a lot your artistic practice. And you said that you would like to talk a little bit about the music that you use in the film for the artistic composition and about this kind of sonic layer. We also talked about that you used some music by Drexia for another project of yours, the CS History, I think. So there's another very interesting connection also to this show. But yeah, in Lettres du Voyant, there is the nightclub scene. There is the voodoo ritual that we see, where there is a very, very, where music is omnipresent and very, very important for the artistic composition. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you use it and what it means in the context of the film.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, so, I mean, like where to begin? There's so much there. I mean, I think, so just to begin at the beginning, you know, before I started making films, I studied films. And I was very, very taken with the work of Douglas Sirk. He was like a huge influence on my... I don't think you see it in the films necessarily, but Douglas Sirk is very important. Not just Sirk, but Sirk specifically, and then from that, like American melodrama. And melodrama, just that word, it means like melodic drama, right? So it's like it's drama, it's cinema, it's narrative, but that's pushed through with music. But also, like, I think Sirk has a great sensibility to color, obviously, and like how color works in melodic and sonic terms. So it's like how music and color sort of combine to create and sort of push emotional engagements with certain scenes within a sort of fictional space. And so I think I kind of just took that on. I just always wanted to make melodramas or melodramatic documentaries, like in a way. So the film Visionary Letters that was upstairs is definitely an engagement with like color and music as ways to kind of push your emotional, like to sort of manipulate your emotions, basically. Well, that's what cinema is anyway. I think we can be clear about that. Or can be. Cinema can be, not always. There's other types of cinema, surely. But so in the film Lettres du Voyant, I mean, there's this scene, halfway through, kind of towards the end, like 30 minutes in, where we see, this like ritual and sacrifice of some animals, and then this moment where somebody actually falls into a trance whilst dancing to some drumming. And what is happening at that moment, this person is actually being mounted by a spirit, and then they actually embody the spirit within their own flesh and bones. And at that moment, the drumming gets reconfigured into a different sort of melodic space. And that happens again through digital technology, through using software. So that specific moment in the film is like another instance of how we can use digital technologies to re-enhance and adapt our aesthetic appreciation of an event. And what I mean by that is just the reception of your surroundings through your senses. But then also, so that's how it kind of gets driven into this thing of like melodrama. But then also music, then I used Drexciya in 3 films. I used them a long time ago in a film I made in 2010 called Capital, kind of blunt title. And it's not a very good film, actually. I only showed it once, and now I keep it hidden. It's like a secret, because it's pretty bad. But I showed it once at the BFI, the British Film Institute in London, and I just put Drexciya on in the beginning really, really loud, and just made people sit in the cinema for like 10 minutes and listen to Drexciya, which was really good fun. And then I used Drexciya again later in All That Is Solid, and then I recently used Drexciya, in this film called The Sea is History. And The Sea is History is a film that was made, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So anyway, I won't talk about that because it's like a whole nother project. But just to say that like the music that I use is only ever used in small portions. And if I ever use music, which I do a lot, it's only ever to, again, thinking about how music can have a sort of like, in the one hand, this thing of pushing and manipulating and driving emotional responses to the scene that's being acted on the film, but also how the music can itself have a kind of historical narrative resonance with the film itself. So like I did this film in Egypt called Logical Revolts, and in that film you hear like radio and bits of song and things like that, which are actually all songs that were being written about the revolution. And the film speaks about the history of the revolution in Egypt from 1952 to 2012. And then, so it's like how music is used as well as something that adds another sort of historic layer to give a bit more context, perhaps, to the film. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Louis. Are there any questions from the audience? Now would be the opportunity to engage in a discussion with us, with Louis. Do you want to ask, are there any questions? If not, I have one more, of course. But please feel free to join the discussion. That would be fantastic. We met for the first time, Louis and I, in 2015 for a project that we developed together with Judith Funke, called Every Step You Take. Yeah. And you came for the first time, I think, to Dortmund. Yeah. And we had a very interesting conversation over there at the Schauspiel Dortmund, at the theater. You showed the film. I think it was produced in 2014 as well, and it's kind of connected to Lettres du Voyant. It was a kind of different context. You start a discussion about this very popular at the time and still popular metaphor and image of the cloud in computer technology. As a storage of data, and how this image kind of obfuscates all the geopolitical problems and implications and exploitation that is kind of part of the production, fabrication, and of the use of technology nowadays. And you kind of dedicate this film to this exploration of the materiality of digital technology. And it's kind of structured in a way that we can follow your research, right? We see your desktop at the beginning of the film, and it's very interesting when you see it on a computer, because suddenly the mouse starts moving, the pointer, like a ghost is moving it, you know. Yeah. So I would like to ask you, how is this? Yeah, how's the connection to Lettres du Voyant? Because I think that it uses some of the footage that you that you shot in Ghana during the same research trip. I think that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, so that's a film from 2014 called All That Is Solid. And that was actually made initially as a commission for an exhibition in Paris. And yet again, it's always just gets down to economics, I suppose. It was like, this is typical of the art world as well, which is where they just expect you to produce works for no money. Or they give you some money, they say, oh, we have this budget. And you go, okay, what's the fee as well? And they say, well, you got your fee in your budget. Mm-hmm. You got like this money. You figure it out. Like you get your fee in your budget. And you're like, so that means I get no fee, right? Because my budget's going to eat up everything. So I'm working for free. So anyway, so the guys at this exhibition in Paris, I said to them, what's your budget? And they said, oh, it's okay. It's like 500 euros. I said, oh, 500 euros to make a film? Like, Jesus. Films cost a bit more. And at that time, I was broke. I still always broke, I guess. So I was like, okay, cool, just give me the 500 euros. So I took the 500 euros and I paid my rent, right? Okay. I was living, this was subsidized rent as well. This is at the Cité des Arts, help for artists from the French government. And they're still paying 425 euros. So I spent 425 euros on rent, 75 euros probably on bread and wine. And that was a month in my studio in Paris. And then I literally just sat there and was like, right, I have to make a film. So I made the film entirely, inside my studio, inside my bedroom, without leaving. So that was the first time that I started to make work by looking into the computer, the space of the computer, as a space within which we can construct narrative. So what that film involves, it's got a few things. It's got that kind of economic thing about it, which is that like I was forced into rethinking my own approach to cinema precisely because of like a difficult economic situation called being broke. And then also, anyway, the reason why it made sense is because the film was focusing on the way in which these young Ghanaians in this place, Agblogboshi, were recycling computer parts. So on the one hand, they're actually rebuilding computers from trash, from like waste, from computer waste. And then they're also doing this thing, like I said, extracting precious metals from computer hardware. So I thought, well, I want to make a film about recycling of computer hardware through recycling my own footage that's kept in my computer hardware. And so the film actually does a kind of archaeological dig or a sort of extractivist practice of going through my own hard drives and looking through my hard drives for material and drawing them out. And then it displays it all on the desktop. And so the desktop gets treated as the narrative space. But then that gets, montaged, and I kind of borrowed this term from Harun Farocki, so it's like what he calls soft montage. So it's not necessarily image coming after an image, like in traditional montage, but a montage where you place images side by side and you draw comparisons between them. And so what I do is I use a lot of video from the internet. So it's a film that actually gets made through digging in my own archives, my hard drives, but also digging through the space of the internet for fragments of material that I can use to then narrate a story about the history of Ghana as the Gold Coast, and then its relationship with this practice of technology today. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more last question, a very short question, because I think it would be very interesting for everyone to know a little bit about your future projects. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what you're researching right now and what you're working on.
Yeah, so at the moment it's a long project. It's taken a long time to do. I started writing it in 2013, but it's a project about the history of a figure called Toussaint Louverture, who's a very famous, or relatively famous, maybe none of you have heard of him here, or some of you have heard of him surely, but he was one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution that began in 1791, which was a very significant revolution within world history, 2 years after the French Revolution began, and was actually perhaps, you know, the only revolution of that period that actually accomplished what the French Revolution purportedly set out to do, which was to sort of create this sense of a sort of universalist project, which I think the French Revolution and the American Revolutions definitely didn't do, was sort of flawed in many respects. So anyway, the film looks at this character, Toussaint Louverture, but it focuses on the last days of his life, because he was actually arrested by Napoleon and taken to France, and he was put in a prison in the furthest, most eastern point of France, so literally as far away as possible from Haiti. And but basically, so there was a play that was written about this episode in the life of Toussaint Louverture. The play was written by Edouard Glissant, famous Martiniquean poet and philosopher, but the play was written in French, in quite a sort of literary 1960s French. And if you read the introduction to the play, Glissant says, I understand the problems of writing this play in French, because, for example, he writes the voice or the words of like a very famous revolutionary slave from the period who would never have spoken in this perfect literary French. And Glissant says, well, I leave it up to the performers and the people that want to work with this text to do the translation into Creole, if they think that's important. So I was in Haiti. I'd been there a few times, and I was there a while ago seeing a friend, and I said to him, and he's an actor and a slam poet. I don't know if you know what slam poetry is. So he's a slam poet, and we did some work together before, and I said to him, yeah, there's this play by Edouard Glissant, and he does this proposition, and my friend Rossi was like, let's do it, let's translate it into Creole. So I was like, all right, if you're up for it, let's try and figure this out. So we got a group of people together, 8 people, all from Port-au-Prince, young, they're all in their 20s, they're actors, slam poets, writers. And I was there for like 3 weeks in July, and I was working with my friend Olivier Marbeuf, who's from France, who's a curator and a performer and a writer. And we did these workshops where we were trying to translate the play into Creole. But we're not just translating the play into Creole, we're also translating it in terms of how it will be sort of like played and kind of performed. So we're kind of trying to make it more contemporary with different forms of performing techniques. So we're introducing like music and slam poetry and things like that. And then now I go back. I'm going to Haiti on the 6th of November for 2 months, and we're going to continue doing this project of a play, which we're going to put on for a biennial, which is there's going to be a performance on December the 16th in Port-au-Prince of the play. And then around that, I'm going to be filming. But like the plan is to like try and figure out with the actors the ways in which we could film this. So for me, it's an attempt to try and figure out a new way of working with the people that I'm working with. So rather than me doing all the filming and the writing and all this, it's really a rather experimental attempt at trying to figure out like what it would mean to do a sort of collective project. So I'm trying in some respects to dissolve the authorship of the work, and we're going to spend these months deciding how we're going to put it into film. At the same time, we're going to be filming those processes. So we're thinking of different techniques of like multi-camera scenes which we'll shoot with iPhones and GoPros, and it will be the actors filming themselves and passing the camera between them and things like that. And then that's going to be coupled with a shoot that I do in France in February in the place where Louverture was imprisoned, and we're going to kind of draw those two pieces together and make a film out of it. But it sounds kind of messy, but then I quite like the fact that it potentially is messy, because I think it's a good time to sort of mess up the practice a little bit, you know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Louis, for sharing all of this. Thanks for being here. And thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the talk.